Hey everyone, so let's now talk about a node that doesn't sound like anything but is super important, and that is the add node. Now, the wording of this node is really confusing because first of all, it doesn't seem like doing much, but we will see it can do a lot. And the second thing, it says it does add something. Even though half of the things I will show you is the opposite of that, it is actually used quite a lot for deleting stuff. So this node is really surprisingly important, but it doesn't seem like that at all. And we will use that throughout the course quite a lot. So let's start with the obvious part. And that is, yes, you can actually use that node to create stuff, to add things. And that is single points. So this is right, the first tab here. You can turn the first point on, and what you get is a single point at 0, 0, 0. So let's change that number to, let's say, 0, 1, 0. And you have a single point at 0, 1, 0. And you can also press enter in the viewport and position that point. And you can do that with multiple points even. Yay! So you can create a couple of points in different positions. Now, yeah, that doesn't seem like super important, but keep in mind, we haven't actually seen a way to do this yet. We have seen stuff like, okay, we know how to create a circle or a sphere or a curve, with a curve node, or the draw curve node, or even the line, for example, to create a line. So we've seen all kinds of nodes to create shapes and forms and curves and all that, but we actually haven't seen a way of creating a single position in space or a single point in space. And this is what the add node allows. So this can become very handy later on. So this is really cool and all, but does it really justify a separate video? Of course not. So let's look at all the other funky stuff we can do with the add node. The first thing is right here in the points tab, and only makes sense when you input anything into the first input. And that is delete geometry but keep the points. So for example, if I take a geometry that of course is made of points, as you can see here, we can take this as an input to an add node, and when I turn this button on, you can see it deletes everything except the points of the geometry, which can sometimes be very helpful. Of course, the same is true for stuff like a sphere and so on and so forth. So this is interesting even for normal geometry sometimes, but a use case where I use this quite a lot is when we talk about packed geometry. So we've seen that before. What you can do in Houdini is you can pack geometry into a single point. And one node that does that for multiple objects is actually assemble. And this is a node we will work with later on, so ignore this for now. But what I did now is I turned all the pieces of my geometry that we can actually show with exploded view. This, as you can see, my toy here is made of multiple different objects. And those objects I can turn into single points with the assemble node by turning on create packed geometry, and it finds all the geometry that is connected and turns it into a point. And this is why it creates 10 different packed points here, because each piece that we just saw here is now turned into a single point. This can be super helpful for all kinds of stuff that we'll look later on. But what's useful in the context here with the add is the function of the add node that we just saw, the delete geometry but keep the points, because in a case like this where we have packed geometry, it deletes the geometry of a packed point, so basically the content of a packed point, and only keeps the point. And this is pretty helpful, for example, to find the center of an object. Because if I have, for example, a box, and I take, for example, not an assemble but just a normal pack because it's just one object, this is now turned into a single point, which is always the center of the object. And if I use an add again with the delete geometry but keep the points turned on, I now have a single point that is in the center of where my box was. So this is a really helpful way, pack combined with an add, to turn the center of an object or multiple objects into a point. And multiple objects, for this we can use an assemble instead of a pack. So I hope this makes sense. If not, it will make more sense later on. Just keep in mind that the add allows you to actually, keep just the point of a packed point. Okay, So what else can we do with the add node? This is really helpful, as we will see, but there's another thing we can do under polygons, and that is remove unused points. Now this makes more sense when we create an example for this, because what sometimes happens, and we haven't seen this yet, is that you have sometimes rogue points that float around that are not connected to any geometry. And this, for example, can happen when you have a procedural way of deleting parts of your geometry. What I did here is I created a random number on each point and then used a BLAS to say, okay, if this random number is lower than 0.3, it will be deleted. The point will be deleted. What this results in is that there's obviously some holes, but what's more interesting is that sometimes it ends up keeping points that are not connected to anything. That doesn't seem to be a problem, but we will see later on cases like that can happen quite a lot, and they can create all kinds of headaches. Because, for example, those points will later be rendered as spheres, which is annoying, and also it can, interfere with some nodes when you have, those rogue points that just float around and do nothing. And to fix this is actually something we can use the add node for. Again, under polygons, right, the first checkbox here is remove unused points. And as you can see, all this does is it deletes those points that have no purpose. So keep that in mind, because that is very often a necessary fix to kind of clean your geometry when you do some weird stuff with it, like I did here in this example. So as you can see, two use cases where the add node does the complete opposite of what it's called like. In both cases, it deletes stuff or removes stuff. And this is why I said the naming of the node is really weird. But the final thing is actually doing an add function again. And that is, it allows you to connect points as curves. So let's do a simple example for this. And we just take a sphere and scatter on top of it. So we have just random points in space. Let's make a few of them. And then we can use the add node and go to polygon by group, and instantly you can see what it does. It connects the points with curves. Now, how does it connect them? By their point number. So it looks at their numbers and simply connects them in order, which very often looks a bit strange and is not necessarily always what you want. One way of changing this, by the way, is using the sort node, which sometimes allows you to find a better way of renumbering your points. And this can be used in combination with the add node to kind of find a better connection logic. But frankly, very often this will not solve your problem. And for this, there's actually another option under add here. You can use an attribute to connect certain points. That's something I won't really show you here because it's a bit too complex. Just keep that in mind. We can later on make sure that points are connected that share the same value in an attribute, which will be important later on. But before that, we can actually also switch to another function. For example, skip every nth point or groups of n points. So that means we can connect only a group of points. And actually, let's try this with a grid, because then it's a bit easier to see what it does. So with a normal grid, where we can actually use another add node first to turn this grid into just points by using the first function that we saw, or the second. And then we can now see by default it does that because it follows the naming of the points or the numbering of the points and creates this kind of zigzag shape. And here it makes more sense to see what the functions do. You can turn them into groups. For example, always connect 5 points or always connect 2 points and so on. And you can see here what you can do with this if you need it. I can't really tell you what to do exactly with this. I just want to point out that this is possible. You can also say skip every nth point, and then you basically can create something like this. I don't know. This is maybe, all kinds of funny things you can do. So it allows you to kind of find all kinds of patterns that you want to use to connect points. The best way of understanding this a bit better is playing around with it. All you should remember is you can use the add node to connect points with curves. And this is actually something we need quite often. So as you can see, this little add node that doesn't seem to do much is actually really powerful, and we will use it quite a lot. You can use it to create points, even multiple points, with specific positions in space. then you can use the node, even though the name suggests something completely different, to actually delete geometry and only keep the points of the geometry, which is also helpful in combination with packed geometry. We will see that later on. Then you can use the function under polygons, remove unused points, which is very often an important way of fixing problems with your geometry, because when you do funky stuff like I do, often you have rogue points floating around that create a lot of problems, and this node allows you to find those and delete them if they're not connected to anything. And finally, it allows you to connect points in form of curves by all kinds of different rules. So you can choose certain amount of connections, skip certain numbers of connections, and even choose later on an attribute that the connection will be based on. So as you can see, the add node, pretty powerful. Play around with this a little bit, but for now, I hope this was helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.